Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics Lectures. This is lecture number 116 in the Harvard Classics Lectures, Walden, chapter 17, Spring. Of course, many have argued this is their favorite chapter of all of Walden, the awakening of the earth and all of that. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net in the Harvard Classics folder for this series of lectures, lectures 99 through 115. Commenting on every chapter thus far on Walden, as well as in the junior folder. We've commented elsewhere on learnstrong.net about transcendentalism and Emersonian thought. We also assume that you know our three levels of reading. What does the text say? Level 1, what does the text mean? Level 2, themes, messages to a rhetorical understandings to be. And then finally, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At level 3A, other texts, including other chapters of Walden. And finally, can I relate to it myself? Many have taken so seriously and personally the final two chapters. I like to think about our big five, as we refer to them. What does this text say about ontology, what we can know, ontology, who we are, epistemology, what we can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, study of the individual mind, sociology, study of the group, and then finally the question of theodicy. I like to think about these last two chapters, and we've said all the way through that these pairs of chapters are compelling. Thoreau as prophet, Thoreau as builder. There are a lot of different ways to think about it. Let's do a quick review and then share a few lines. Of course, the spring will begin with, at Walden, the breaking up of the ice, a celebration of rebirth, right? Renaissance, both nature as well as obviously the individual Thoreau's spirit as well. He again presents the pond one more time as, I mean, it's fair to call it a microcosm, right? He says, quote, the phenomenon of the year take place every day in a pond on a small scale. He loves to listen, he loves to watch for the evidences of the spring, and then he describes, obviously, with this amazing eye of his, this sand foliage patterns made by throwing sand and clay flowing down. He calls it grotesque but beautiful, right? An early sign, obviously, of spring, the intense growth. In its, the foliage, right, the sand foliage as well will demonstrate nothing is inorganic, he will say. The earth is not an artifact of dead history, right? Rather, it's, he calls it, living poetry, right? And I called Walden a poem because I think Thoreau himself understood that he was a poet creating a prose poem. That's quite remarkable. We're going to have all kinds of expressions of the expansion, the exhilaration, the joy of spring, lots and lots of exclamation marks. I mean, let's put that right now at level 2, at level 2B. He will focus, of course, on the awakening of spring, and obviously this will be the awakening of himself as well. He asks about chronology, he asks about traditions, he asks about these written revelations, and as well he talks about immortality, right? Surviving death even. He says Walden it appears to have died in the same way we talk about Ruthie's tree, that sometimes in the fall and winter looks dead and yet is not. And now, of course, in the spring, everything comes back. Now, you can't read, I don't believe you can read Walden without an appreciation of Chaucer. We've given full lectures on Chaucer's and Canterbury Tales and those opening lines in the general prologue. I think all of that as well stands behind everything that's happening in this chapter. He talks about how a person's thoughts will improve with spring. Right? Because he says you become reinvigorated. He calls it elastic, right? You're able to stretch. And the ability to forgive and to forget shortcomings. We're going to love these lines when we read them, right? We'll start over. He will talk about the need for what he calls the, quote, tonic of wildness, end quote, right? Noting, of course, that life would stagnate if we didn't have it. And he comments also on the duality. We've talked already at length in this poem about how yin and yang are standing always behind the harmony in nature. And of course this leads to a longing for the mysterious. He will talk about we can never have enough of nature. It's the source of everything for us. He'll talk about the passage of time. He'll talk about rolling on into summer, and then all of a sudden the narrative is ended. And he will compare his entire second year at the pond and to the first, and he'll assume it in one sentence, and the second year was similar to it. Many have said that the last sentence where he records his departure, September the 6th, 1847, as being remarkably abrupt. I don't think it is abrupt because I think really we have to read spring and conclusion together. Let's go to some of the lines in spring, and as I've said, guys, so many times, I would love to be able to just read it all to you. I can't, but there's a few lines. He says, the phenomena of the year take place every day in a pond on a small scale, every morning, generally speaking. The shallow waters being warmed more rapidly than the deep, though it may not be made so warm after all. And every evening it's being cooled more rapidly until the morning. The day, he says, is an epitome of the year. The night is the winter, the morning and evening are the spring and fall, and the noon is the summer. A few lines later he says, one attraction in coming to the woods to live was that I should have leisure and opportunity to see the spring come in. Now we're back to this notion of looking versus really seeing, right? We've commented on this many times in our study together. And here he'll say it as well. I always thought that I was seeing spring, but when I moved to Walden and I was living out there in the woods, I actually began to experience the phenomenon of spring. He says, the ice in the pond at length begins to be honeycombed, and I can set my heel in as I walk. Fogs and rains and warmer suns are gradually melting the snow. The days have grown sensibly longer, and I see how I shall get through the winter without adding to my woodpile, for large fires are no longer necessary. He says, I'm on the alert for the first signs of spring, to hear the chance note of some arriving bird, or the striped squirrel's chirp, or for his stores must be now nearly exhausted, or see the woodchuck venture out of his winter quarters. And then he gives us the dates for the last few years when Walden finally was opened up because of the ice and all of that. He even mentions Methuselah. And I love how he will make these references or these allusions to biblical allusions and just kind of off the cuff, obviously assuming as readers that we feel comfortable with that, right? He says, at length the sun's rays have attained the right angle, and warm winds blow up mist and rain and melt the snowbanks, and the sun, dispersing the mist, smiles, I love how he personifies everything, on a checkered landscape of russet and white smoking with increase, through which the traveler picks his way from islet to islet, cheered by the music of 1,000 tinkling rills and rivulets, whose veins are filled with the blood of winter, which they are bearing off. Again, I mean, poets will often say, if I could write one line as beautifully as that prose poem is. He says, few phenomena gave me more delight than to observe the forms which thawing sand and clay assume in flowing down the sides of a deep cut on the railroad through which I passed on my way to the village, a phenomenon not very common on so large a scale, though the number of freshly exposed banks of the right material must have been greatly multiplied since railroads were invented. And then he says it, when the frost comes out in the spring and even in the thawing day in the winter, the sand begins to flow down the slopes like lava, and then he'll go into this amazing, he calls it grotesque vegetation. A few lines later he says it this way, when I see on the one side the inert bank, for the sun acts on one side first, he's talking about the pond, right? And on the other, this luxuriant foliage, the creation of an hour. I'm affected as if in a particular sense I stood in the laboratory of the artist who made the world, and me had come to where he was still at work, sporting on this bank, and with excess of energy, strewing his fresh designs about it. And I think the word energy is the key to reading this poem. I really do. I think everything about Walden is about energy. He says, I feel as if I were nearer to the vitals of the globe, for this sandy overflow is something such a fallacious mass as the vitals of the animal body. You find thus in the very sands an anticipation of the vegetable leaf. No wonder that the earth expresses itself outwardly in leaves. It so labors with the idea inwardly. Now, we've commented on the relationship between Thoreau and Whitman and the purported somewhat cool back and forth. I think they were both on the same track. I think they understood the power of leaves, and I think that's why Whitman called it leaves of grass. And here, we've made this comment many times, the power of a leaf. He continues by talking about this notion of the way spring opens up everything. He says, it's wonderful how rapidly yet perfectly the sand organizes itself as it flows, using the best material its mass affords to form the sharp edges of its channel. Such are the sources of rivers. In the salacious matter which the water deposits is perhaps the bony system, and in the still finer soil and organic matter, the fleshy fiber or cellular tissue. Thoreau, as physician, we might say, a lover of anatomy, right? He says, what is man but a mass of thawing clay? And then he goes off on this idea. It's wonderful, right? That He's able to reduce, I mean, we're walking dirt. We all know this. We've said this many times, and yet here it's quite beautiful. He says, then about frost, this is the frost coming out of the ground. This is spring. It precedes the green and flowery spring as mythology precedes regular poetry. Gotta love that, right? He knows how to start with his Homer as well. I know of nothing more purgative of winter fumes and indigestions. And the fact he uses purgative, of course, makes us think about Aristotle and poetics, doesn't it? It convinces me that earth is still in her swaddling clothes and stretches forth baby fingers on every side. Fresh curls spring from the baldest brow. There is nothing inorganic. And then he will go on to talk about these foliaceous heaps lie along the bank like the slag of a furnace, showing that nature is in full blast within. The earth, he says, is not a mere fragment of dead history, stratum upon stratum like the leaves of a book to be studied by geologists and antiquaries chiefly, but living poetry, like the leaves of a tree which precede flowers and fruit, not a fossil earth, but a living earth. And then a few lines later he says it this way, ere long, not only on these banks, but on every hill and plain and in every hollow, the frost comes out of the ground like a dormant quadruped from its burrow, and seeks the sea with music, or migrates to other climes and clouds. Thaw, with his general persuasion, is more powerful than Thor with his hammer. The one melts, the other but breaks in pieces. I mean, it's wonderful the way that Thoreau feels comfortable dancing between the mythologies. And then, a few lines later, he's ready to indulge. Let's get ready for exclamation points, if you will. The first sparrow of the spring, exclamation point. There was a scholar who pointed out that after Thoreau and Whitman, the American personality was defined by an exclamation point. And I think there's some reason here in this passage to appreciate that. The first sparrow of spring, the year beginning with the younger hope than ever, the faint silvery warblings heard over the partially bare and moist fields from the bluebird, the songbird, the song sparrow, and the redwing, as if the last flakes of winter tickled as they fell. And again, another exclamation point. What at such a time are histories, chronologies, traditions, and all written revelations? Obviously asking the rhetorical question, right? He says, the brooks sing carols and glees to the spring. The marsh hawk sailing low over the meadow is already seeking the first slimy life that awakes. The sinking sound of melting snow is heard in all dells, and the ice dissolves apace on the ponds. The grass, he says, flames on the hillsides like a spring fire, as if the earth sends forth an inward heat to greet the returning sun. Not yellow, but green is the color of its flame, the symbol of perpetual youth. And again, it's Thoreau's genius that he will often provide a symbol without using the word symbol, and then other times he'll say, let me make sure you didn't miss this, the whole thing of what game we're really playing here. He says the grass blade, sounding very much now like Whitman, the grass blade, like a long green ribbon, streams from the sod into summer, checked indeed by the frost, but anon, pushing on again, lifting its spear of last year's hay with the fresh life below. The fact that he even uses spear, and of course Whitman will do the same when he talks about a spear of summer grass. It grows as steadily as the rill oozes out of the ground. So our human life but dies down to its root, and still puts forth its green blade to eternity. I mean, as I've said, so there's so many of these chapters, well, every chapter, right? He has lines that we as poets would love to just come up with one of these, and it's just one right after the other. He says, Walden is melting apace, and then he begins to talk about the melting process. He says, such is the contrast between winter and spring. Walden was dead and is live again, but this spring it broke up more steadily, as I have said. And then he says, yesterday was cold gray ice. There lay the transparent pond already calm and full of hope, as in a summer evening, reflecting a summer evening sky in its bosom, though none was visible overhead, as if it had intelligence with some remote horizon. This as if is, of course, evidence of his epistemological fallibility. That is to say, I could be right, but I could be wrong, but I think I'm right about this. He says, I heard a robin in the distance. The first I'd heard for many 1,000 years, methought, whose note I shall not forget for many 1,000 more. The same sweet and powerful song as of yore. Oh, the evening robin at the end of a New England summer day! Exclamation point. If I could ever find the twig he sits upon, I mean the twig. I love how he does this, right? If I could find the twig he sits upon. No, I'm not talking about the bird. I'm talking about the twig. Such a beautiful way to say everything is so symbiotic, organic in the world of nature. He says, some mornings with the geese appearing, that Walden appeared like an artificial pond for the amusement of the geese. And then he finishes by saying, as every season seems best to us in its turn, so the coming in of spring is like the creation of cosmos out of chaos and the realization of the golden age. And then he's ready to talk about spring rain. And I think Chaucer obviously is taking him there. A single gentle rain makes the grass many shades greener, so our prospects brighten on the influx of better thoughts. We should be blessed if we lived in the present always, and took advantage of every ancient that befell us, like the grass which confesses the influence of the slightest dew that falls on it, and did not spend our time in atoning for the neglect of past opportunities, which we call doing our duty. This is his response to Kant, we might say. To live in the present, right? This is the goal, he says. In a pleasant spring morning, all man's sins are forgiven. Now he's going to talk about spring, not just from its literal, but from its figurative and, of course, its religious, spiritual connotations as well. Such a day is a truce to vice. While such a sun holds out to burn, the vilest sinner may return. Through our own recovered innocence, we discern the innocence of our neighbors. Pure Plato's Republic, cave allegory. Once you've escaped from the cave, and you no longer are an individual prisoner sitting looking at shadows on a wall chained up, you cannot help but feel some sense of pity for those still stuck in the cave. You want to return, Socrates says, to help emancipate them. Forgive them, for they know not what they do, is what one Jesus Christ said hanging on a cross, right? You may have known your neighbor yesterday for a thief, a drunkard, or a sensualist, and merely pitied or despised him and despaired of the world. But the sun shines bright and warm this first spring morning, recreating the world. And you meet him at some serene work and see how his exhausted and debauched veins expand with still joy and bless the new day. Feel the spring effulgence with the innocence of infancy, and all his faults are forgotten. There is not only an atmosphere of goodwill about him, but even a savor of holiness groping for expression blindly and ineffectually, perhaps, like a newborn instinct. Learn to look at people again, and you can enjoy, as he says it, even he has entered the joy of his Lord. He says, a return to goodness produced each day in the tranquil and beneficent breath of the morning causes that in respect to the love of virtue and the hatred of vice, one approaches a little the primitive nature of man, as the sprouts of the forest which have been felled. It's a compelling idea that we are somehow able to return back to the real essence, right? He talks about a nighthawk, the Merlin, it seemed to me, it might be called. I love how he dances from his myth to his myth. He says, there needs no stronger proof of immortality. All things must live in such a light. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where was thy victory then? John Donne's, obviously, Sonnet 10 is going to come to mind immediately. We've given a full lecture on that one. He says, our village life would stagnate if it were not for the unexplored forests and meadows which surround it. We need the tonic of wildness, to wade sometimes in marches where the bitron and the meadow hen lurk, and hear the booming of the snipe, to smell the whispering sedge where only some wilder and most solitary fowl builds her nest, and the mink crawls with its belly close to the ground. At the same time that we are earnest to explore and learn all things, we require that all things be mysterious and unexplorable, that land and sea be infinitely wild, unsurveyed and unfathomed by us, because unfathomable. I love, as we have said many times, what Jordan Peterson has to say about this. We seem to dance between our love of the known, it sometimes is boring, but the love of the known, and then our fascination with chaos, with the unknown, and the way we dance back and forth between the two. We must be refreshed by the sight of inexhaustible vigor, vast and titanic features, the seacoast with its wrecks, we think of the dry selvages of Four Quartets, T.S. Eliot, the wilderness with its living and its decaying trees, the thundercloud and the rain which lasts 3 weeks and produces freshets. We need to witness our own limits transgressed. I mean, what a great line. We need to witness our own limits transgressed in some life, pasturing freely where we never wander. He continues, he says, I love to see that nature is so rife with life that myriads can be afforded to be sacrificed and suffered to prey on one another. That tender organizations can be so serenely squashed out of existence like tadpoles which herons gobble up, tortoises and toads run over in the road, and that sometimes it has rained flesh and blood. Now, of course, this is Theodicy 101, right? In other words, yes, there is pain in the world. Yes, there is suffering in the world, without doubt. And as we have said many times, Thoreau will argue, instead of asking, why did it happen to me, we must learn to ask, why did it happen for me? Can I learn something from all of this pain, from all of this suffering? The impression, he says, with the liability to accident, we must see how little account is to be made of it. The impression made on a wise man is that of universal innocence. Poison is not poisonous after all, nor are any wounds fatal. Compassion is a very untenable ground. It must be expeditious. Its pleadings will not bear to be stereotyped. And then he finishes very abruptly. Thus, he says, and so the seasons went rolling on into summer as one rambles into higher and higher grass. Again, this use of the verb ramble or saunter to talk about his walking. Thus was my first year in the woods completed, and the second year was similar to it. And then the last line of spring, the chapter. I finally left Walden, September 6th, 1847. 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days after he had arrived. Well, come back and we'll finish with a conclusion. How does one finish with a conclusion? Well, I think a lot of it is Thoreau, the dramaticist, and Thoreau, the lover of Tiresias, and Merlin, for that matter. We'll